In this module, we are going to focus and concentrate on the pricing of factor services in a situation where the factor market is imperfectly competitive. We can talk about various implications of an imperfectly competitive factor market. The first thing we need to understand is, when is the factor market said to be imperfectly competitive? In a situation of imperfectly competitive factor market may arise when there is a single buyer, we call it monopsony. That means the firm has complete control over demand for the factor. And in this kind of a situation, when the firm has complete control over demand for the factor, what happens is that the firm can influence the demand, or it has complete control over demand, and therefore it could fix the price at which it would like to make the demand. And as a result of this, normally what will happen is that a monopsonist who has control over demand will also invariably tend to be a monopolist in the product market. That means the firm has control over demand for the factor, and it also has control over the supply of the product in the product market. Now, in this kind of a situation, what will happen is there will be a divergence between the AR and the MR. MR happens because of the fact that the firm tends to be a monopolist in the product market. Now, what will be the implications of this? When there is divergence between the AR and the MR, what happens is the VMP tends to be greater than the MRP. So, essentially, the point which we are trying to make is that in a situation where the factor market is imperfectly competitive on account of the fact that one of the firms has complete control over demand, or if it is not one of the firms that has complete control over demand, it is quite possible that a group of firms may join hands to form themselves into a monopoly kind of a situation on the demand side. We call it an oligopsony kind of a situation. So, what we are going to discuss in this particular module is the implications of the fact that that there is monopoly on the buying side, or in other words, the firm has complete control over the demand for the factor. Now, when this kind of a situation happens, as we already mentioned it earlier as well, and in this particular module itself, I mentioned that the firm tends to be a monopoly and a monopsony, and therefore there is divergence between AR and MR. Now, let us try and understand the implications of this divergence between AR and MR. See, when we convert the product, the physical product MPP, into its money equivalent, in case the firm is a perfectly competitive firm in the factor market, then what will happen is the AR is equal to MR, and therefore the VMP is going to be equal to its MRP. But in case the firm happens to be a monopsony, its AR is going to be greater than its MR. As a result of that, the VMP would be lying higher than the MRP schedule. Now, when the firm has to determine its equilibrium in terms of employment, how many units to employ, what the firm will tend to do is it will equate its VMP curve. It will equate its VMP curve with the marginal expense curve or the average expense curve, depending upon whether we are talking about perfect competition in the factor market or an imperfectly competitive situation in the factor market. If the factor market is perfectly competitive, then the equilibrium would be determined at the point where the average wage curve will be equal to the VMP curve, and at this point the firm would be maximizing the firm would be in equilibrium and will be a profit maximizing firm. Hence, what we can infer from this entire discussion is that, look, unlike perfect competition in both the product market and the factor market, as soon as we incorporate imperfections either into the product market or the factor market, the analysis in terms of factor pricing becomes a little more challenging, a little more complicated. And the challenges arise on account of the fact that introduction of imperfections in the factor market will imply that there is complete control on the demand side, and this firm which controls the demand for factor will also be a monopolist on the supply side. And as a result of this, what is going to happen is there is going to be a divergence. There is going to be a divergence between the MRP and the VMP. In turn, this is going to affect the equilibrium of the firm in terms of the level of employment as well as in terms of the wage rate that is offered to labor. Now, one more thing that has to be kept in mind is that this divergence between VMP and MRP will lead to what is known as monopsonistic exploitation of labor. This arises because of the superior bargaining position of the firm in terms of being able to dictate terms to the employees as to the terms on which the employment will be offered.
By imperfect factor market, we mean to say that owners of factor inputs enjoy market power to determine the factor price and to control its supply. In the labor market, imperfection arises when workers enjoy bargaining power by forming labor union to raise their demand for wage above the equilibrium rate, to restrict the supply of unionized labor, and to demand for other job-related facilities for the welfare of the workers. In other words, labor union is an organization in which all the workers take a collective decision rather than competing with each other. That is, in the factor market, labor union acts as a monopolist. Hence, wage in the market depends on the different goals of the labor union. Among several goals of a labor union, we focus here on the following three important goals by which the union determines the wage rate. These are the maximization of employment, the maximization of the total wage bill, and the maximization of the total gains to the union as a whole. Now we will study how a labor union attempts to fulfill their targets in order to determine wage rate when there exists competitive firm. Let us now discuss the concept of competitive firm and labor union with the help of a diagram. In the figure, we are measuring units of labor in the x-axis. The intersection of aggregate demand and supply of labor determines the highest level of employment at wage rate W0. Therefore, if the objective of the labor union is to maximize the employment level, then it will demand the wage rate OW0 and the employment will be OL0 units of labor. On the other hand, the labor union, it is now required to examine the fact that with these targets, whether the labor union is benefited or not. We begin with the equilibrium under perfectly competitive labor market that happens at point E in the figure. Equilibrium wage rate is W0 and corresponding profit maximizing level of employment is OL0 units of labor. This is the highest amount of labor a firm can hire. Assume that labor union is unless the gain from the increased wage is not distributed among the workers who lost their jobs, the labor union's decision to raise the wage will become vulnerable to them. Note that the union's bargaining power depends on the elasticity of demand for labor. If the demand for labor is inelastic, union can enjoy its maximum market power to raise the wage. On the other hand, if the demand for labor is highly elastic, then with the rise in wage rate, the total wage bill will fall and the entire labor force, other than those who are able to retain their jobs under the labor union, will be worse off.
We can understand the concept of monopsony with the help of a couple of real life examples. For example, in India, in the field of space research, ISRO is the only agency that employs space scientists. Now, anyone who has gone in for studying physics, or anyone who is keen on pursuing space science as a career, will have to basically seek employment with the only agency that is available as far as India is concerned, assuming that the restrictions on mobility of space scientists from India to abroad. Now, as a result, what happens is that ISRO is in a position to dictate terms to the employees, and it may determine the terms on which it is going to offer employment to the scientists pursuing this as a career. Likewise, there are a number of other fields wherein we find that a firm which is a monopolist in the product market tends to be a monopsonist. We can take the example of De Beer in the field of diamond trade. We can take the example in the field of oil refining. Essentially, what we are trying to say is that generally a monopsonist is one who has control on the demand side and is in a position to dictate terms on which it is wanting to employ labor or employ the units of the factor. So, therefore, essentially what we are trying to say is that a monopsonist happens to be a monopolist in the product market. However, this may not necessarily always be the case. We can even have a situation where a firm which is probably operating under competitive conditions in the product market in one situation can be a monopsonist in another situation. Like, for example, let's say the case of ISRO itself. Now, ISRO in the domestic market happens to be a monopsonist and has a monopoly over the terms on which it is going to offer its services, satellite services to the domestic telecasting broadcasters. But when it comes to ISRO offering terms to the telecommunication industries abroad in the international market, then ISRO becomes not a monopoly, but it becomes a competitive firm, meaning that as far as offering the satellite services to the rest of the world is concerned, or as far as ISRO offering the launch facilities to the international clientele is concerned. In the domestic market, it may be a monopoly, but in the international market, it will not be a monopoly, but it will probably be operating under competitive conditions. So, basically, what we are trying to learn in this particular module is that a monopsonist is essentially one which has complete control on the demand side. It can determine the terms on which it is going to offer employment to labor. And usually we would say that a monopsonist happens to be a monopolist in the product market. However, we are also at the same time conscious of the fact that there could be exceptions to this particular situation, and the exception that we are citing is that if the firm is operating both in the domestic market as well as in the international market, then we could get into a situation where it may be a monopolist in the domestic market, but could be operating under competitive conditions in the international market. And essentially what we are trying to say is that introduction of monopsony into the analysis with regard to factor pricing will imply that there will be a divergence between the VMP and the MRP, and this divergence will lead to exploitation of labor.
When a firm enters in the labor market as single buyer or monopsonist and the labor market is unionized, exploitation of labor cannot be fully eliminated. However, the additional exploitation due to the monopsony power of the firm can be eliminated. This implies that monopsonist exploitation will be reduced to monopolistic exploitation. The labor union cannot remove monopolistic exploitation. The presence of both monopsonist firm and labor union in the factor market implies that there exists bilateral monopoly situation, and consequently there will be indeterminacy of wage and employment. A labor union can either increase wage rate or increase employment to increase its total wage bill. In order to avoid the indeterminacy problem of pure bilateral monopoly situation, we assume that the labor union will not maximize its total gain, rather, it will focus to attain the above said two alternative goals. Assume that initially there is no labor union and therefore the equilibrium is attained at point E, where MEL curve intersects the MRPL curve as shown. The monopsonist firm will now hire OL-MS units of labor and will pay wage WMS. Now assume that labor is unionized and assume also that the goal of labor union is to maximize the level of employment. The union therefore sets wage rate W bar M at which the MRPL curve cuts the SL curve. Since below W bar M, workers are not ready to work, the supply curve of labor becomes kinked curve WMBSL, while now the labor union wants to achieve the goal of maximum wage at initial level of employment, LMS, by setting the wage rate equal to W bar U as shown. At this higher wage rate, the supply curve of labor W bar U ECSL becomes kinked at point C, and there is resulting discontinuity at MEL curve. It is divided into two discontinuous parts, WEC and GMEL. The equilibrium is hence, it can be concluded that when there is single buyer firm in the labor market, the labor union can attain higher wage at the expense of lower employment. The benefits of this higher wage enjoyed by all members of the union depends on the elasticity of demand for labor. The labor union can eliminate only the exploitation solely attributable to monopsony power of the firm, but cannot eliminate monopolistic exploitation of labor. Let us now recapitulate what we have learned in this module. Imperfect factor market means factor can affect the factor price. For instance, if laborers are unionized, the union will act as monopolist in the labor market and determine the wage rate. A labor union has primarily three goals. 1. Maximization of employment. 2. Maximization of wage bill. And 3. Maximization of total gains to union. When product market is perfectly competitive, labor union can fulfill any of these goals. When there exists labor union, a competitive firm will face kinked supply curve of labor as labor union sets the wage rate. The union's bargaining power depends on the elasticity of demand for labor. If the demand for labor is inelastic, union can enjoy its maximum market power to raise wage or vice versa. In the interaction with monopsonist firm, labor union can only be able to eliminate the labor exploitation solely due to monopsonist power of firm and not the monopolistic exploitation. A labor union can either increase wage rate or increase employment to increase its total wage bill. With some assumptions, we have concluded that when there is single buyer firm in the labor market, the labor union can attain higher wages at the expense of lower employment. The benefits of this higher wage enjoyed by all members of the union depends on the elasticity of demand for labor. The labor union can eliminate only the exploitation solely attributable to monopsony power of the firm, but cannot eliminate monopolistic exploitation of labor.
The role of trade unions that we have been talking about will be affected by the kind of market structure that we have in our mind. Like, for example, one of the ultimate objectives of the trade unions is to reduce oblique eliminate exploitation. And in economics, when we talk about exploitation, Mrs. John Robinson has talked about two types of exploitation. She talks about monopolistic exploitation and she talks about monopsonistic exploitation. Monopolistic exploitation arises because of the fact that the firm is a monopoly in the product market and is able to overcharge the customers because the AR is greater than the MR. Monopolistic exploitation arises because the firm has complete control over demand for the factor, as a result of which its VMP, the VMP is greater than the MRP is on account of AR, MR, and the fact that AW, MW, there is a divergence between the AW, MW, that is because of monopsony. So, essentially what we are saying is that the objective of organizing trade unions, or one of the roles that the trade unions want to play, is to reduce or eliminate exploitation, which is either monopolistic in nature or which is monopolistic in nature. What studies have shown is that as far as the monopolistic exploitation of labor is concerned, trade unions are not in a position to succeed much over there, because that is something which can only be overcome through strong, powerfully organized consumer resistance movements. Trade unions have only a very limited role to play there. But as far as monopolistic exploitation is concerned, in the context of monopolistic exploitation, which arises essentially because the firm is a monopolist, the trade unions try to counter the superior bargaining position of the firms because of their control over demand. They try to overcome this through their control over supply, and the trade unions essentially try to make sure that more and more of labor is supplied either at higher and higher prices, or alternately is supplied at a price which has been determined after proper negotiations with the trade union body, and this negotiation happens through a steep collective bargaining agreement. So, essentially one of the roles that the trade unions can play in the context of the equilibrium of a firm is to act as a custodian of the interest of the workers in terms of maximizing employment, in terms of maximizing revenues, or in terms of maximizing the total wage bill. Also, in this context, it has to be kept in mind that in third world countries where the workers are paid a wage rate which is below a fair wage rate, forget about the wage rate being equal to the contribution of the workers, it is below the fair wage rate, which does not even ensure a certain minimum standard of living to its members. The trade unions have to play a role either in terms of pressurizing the government into granting a minimum wage rate to the members. They also have to ensure and act against the fact that the workers are not retrenched. However, the extent to which the trade unions will succeed in any one of these situations, it has to be kept in mind, will depend upon the elasticity of demand for labor. If and only if the demand for labor tends to be inelastic, will the trade unions succeed. Otherwise, they will fail to realize their conflicting goals. The instruments employed by trade unions to achieve their goals have differed from one country to another country. Like for example, in the entire Western Europe and in America, they have relied through the measures to control supply of labor. But in countries like Japan, they have essentially focused on measures on the demand side. In the sense, what the workers have sought to do is they have ensured a hike in their productivity, both in terms of physical hike in terms of physical productivity by putting in longer hours of work, or also in terms of hike in quality of product. Basically, what they have tried to do is they have insisted, or they have been able to persuade and prevail upon the employers to grant them superior working conditions, better training facilities, and greater automation of the plants. And it would be interesting to know that the sharing of hike in productivity that has followed on account of this has been quite significant and substantial in countries like Japan. So, in the context of experiences in Japan, the trade unions have operated not through their control over supply, but in terms of the ability to shift the VMP curve, or in other words, in the ability to increase the demand for labor. And this increase in demand for labor has been through a rightward shift in the VMP curve, and this shift in the VMP curve has been achieved through essentially higher productivity levels, and higher productivity levels have been attained through a more understanding approach both on the part of the workers as well as on the part of the employers. So, what are we trying to essentially say is that, look, we can have generally trade unions putting pressures on the employers through control over supply of labor, or they could also do so, but that of course is an exceptional situation. They could also do so through the focus on enhancement in their productivity and shift in the VMP curve. But the more common methods that have been employed by workers the world over have been focused on control over supply, and this control over supply has been ensured and enforced through harsh collective bargaining measures. Now I think it should be fine.